The Colorado blizzard was brutal, but a local deputy's arrogance was far colder. Handcuffing a quiet veteran and locking his crippled service dog in a freezing trunk, he thought he was just bullying a nameless drifter. He never realized the black phone he carelessly confiscated was a highly classified lifeline to the Pentagon. His petty ego trip had unknowingly blinded the military during a live subterranean hostage crisis. Within minutes, heavily armored Secret Service SUVs would violently breach his precinct to stop a national disaster. Before we step into the storm, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength. The blizzard howling through the peaks of Aspen Ridge did not feel like a natural weather event. It felt like a curated aesthetic for the ultra-wealthy. In this exclusive Colorado enclave, winter was merely a seasonal backdrop for tourists wrapped in ethically sourced mink and locals stepping out of armored, climate-controlled luxury SUVs. The sidewalks of the main commercial promenade were engineered with subterranean thermal coils, instantly melting the heavy snow into a manageable, shimmering slush, ensuring the elite would not have to ruin their designer footwear. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasted pine nuts, expensive espresso, and the sharp metallic tang of the high-altitude cold. Yet, just beyond the reach of the heated pavement, where the snowdrifts piled high and the wind shrieked with unbridled ferocity, walked a man who belonged to an entirely different reality. Von Sterling moved through the knee-deep snow with a disciplined rhythmic cadence. At 58, he possessed the kind of quiet, imposing architecture that commanded immediate space. He stood 6'2", his shoulders broad and dense like a load-bearing wall. He walked with a slight, heavily managed limp favoring his right side, a quiet souvenir from a lifetime spent in subterranean, sub-zero environments where survival was not guaranteed. The biting wind whipped against his clean-shaven, sharply angled jawline. Unlike the stereotypical image of a weathered, bearded veteran retreating from society, Von maintained an absolute, almost clinical standard of grooming. His salt and pepper hair was cut into a meticulously tight undercut, the sides faded close to the scalp, completely defying the rugged, overgrown look expected of a mountain recluse. Walking faithfully by his left knee was Bode. Bode was a 10-year-old German shepherd, and like his handler, he wore the unmistakable map of his history. The dog's muzzle and the arches above his amber eyes were dusted with white fur, a distinguished sugar face that spoke of a long, arduous life. The tip of his left ear carried a sharp V-shaped notch, missing cartilage from a piece of flying shrapnel a lifetime ago. But what drew the most attention was his gear. Bode wore a heavy-duty, crimson-red harness. Along the ribs, large reflective white letters read, "Surface Dog, Do Not Disturb." Because his hind legs were severely compromised by advanced osteoarthritis, Bode wore custom black orthopedic boots to provide traction and stability on the slick ice. Von looked down, his ice-blue eyes softening with a rare, profound tenderness. He slowed his pace, letting the heavy leather leash go slack. Bode didn't complain, didn't whine, even though every step in the freezing temperature likely sent dull aches through his deteriorating hips. The dog simply pushed forward, his loyalty far outweighing his physical pain. "Almost there, buddy?" Von murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that barely carried over the howling wind. Just a few more steps they needed to secure the funds today. The specialized spinal and joint surgery Bode required was scheduled for tomorrow morning in Denver, a procedure that cost more than most luxury sedans. The money had been dispersed to Von's account 48 hours ago, but a sudden administrative freeze had brought them out into the storm. For Von, there was no mission more critical than preserving the life of the only creature who truly understood the weight of his past. Bode was not just a dog. He was a psychiatric anchor, a living, breathing lifeline that kept the dark, suffocating memories of Von's classified operations from pulling him under. Von pushed through the heavy, brass-handled double doors of the Aspen Heritage Bank. The transition from the freezing, chaotic vortex of the blizzard to the hushed, climate-controlled sanctuary of the lobby was jarring. The air inside was balmy, smelling faintly of imported mahogany and the subtle, expensive perfumes of the clientele. Vaulted ceilings supported by massive exposed timber beams trapped the soft, polite murmurs of wealth management. Vaughn reached up and pulled back the hood of his weathered, charcoal canvas parka. He unzipped it halfway, allowing the ambient warmth to reach him. Beneath the heavy coat, he wore his signature garment, a specialized tactical combat shirt. The torso was a tight, olive-drab, moisture-wicking material that clung to his solid frame, while the sleeves were made of heavy-duty camouflage ripstop fabric, featuring distinct horizontal warning stripes across the biceps. The moment Vaughn and Bode stepped onto the polished Italian marble floor, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Wealthy patrons cast sidelong, scrutinizing glances at the towering man in the faded parka and his aging, booted dog. To them, Vaughn was a jarring smudge on their pristine morning canvas. Vaughn didn't care. His heart rate did not elevate, his ego did not bruise. His former special operations training had hardwired him to evaluate environments purely on a tactical level. He registered the location of the security cameras, the thickness of the frosted glass partitions, and the exits. He also registered the presence of the man leaning against a marble pillar near the teller line. Deputy Sheriff Trent Lawson was 28, possessing the kind of aggressive, puffed-up posture that usually masked deep-seated insecurities. Though moonlighting as daytime security for the bank, Trent wore his tactical gear like a theatrical costume. His uniform was tailored a fraction too tight, his utility belt was overloaded with unnecessary gear, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine, completely devoid of snow or scuffs. Trent harbored a deep resentment for the billionaires of Aspen Ridge, yet he desperately craved their validation. He spent his days scanning the lobby, hungry for an opportunity to exert his authority, to prove to everyone that he was the absolute alpha male in the room. When Trent's eyes landed on Vaughn, they locked with predatory disdain. Trent saw the worn canvas coat, the slight limp, and the service dog, and his prejudiced mind immediately constructed a narrative, a drifter playing the sympathy card to squeeze a few bucks out of a wealthy institution. Vaughn ignored the intense stare. He kept Bode in a tight, disciplined heel and approached the manager's desk, an open glass office on the perimeter of the lobby. With a subtle two-finger hand signal, Bode immediately transitioned into a perfect down position beside Vaughn's leg, his breathing calm and measured. Elena Rostova, the branch manager, looked up from her dual monitors. She was 32, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back into an elegant twist. She possessed a sharp, analytical gaze, but as she took in Vaughn's imposing stature and Bode's red harness, her expression softened into polite professionalism. She correctly refrained from addressing or petting the dog. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Elena asked, offering a practiced, welcoming smile. "Morning," Vaughn replied, keeping his voice level. He did not sit. He stood with perfect, relaxed posture. "My name is Vaughn Sterling. I attempted to authorize a wire transfer this morning to a veterinary surgical center, but my online portal indicates an administrative restriction. I need to clear it up." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Let me take a look at that for you. May I have your ID and debit card?" Vaughn reached into his pocket and handed her his identification. As he extended his hand, the fluorescent lights caught the deep, unnatural scars on the back of his left hand and knuckles. The skin there was stark white, completely devoid of pigment, the permanent, devastating signature of severe frostbite from Arctic extractions that did not exist on any official record. Elena swiped the card and studied her screen. For a few seconds, the only sound was the rapid clicking of her keyboard. Vaughn waited in absolute stillness. He casually rotated his left wrist inward, checking the time on his matte black titanium analog watch, a deeply ingrained operational habit to prevent the watch face from reflecting light. Then, Elena's professional smile faltered. A subtle crease appeared between her brows. She clicked her mouse again, reading the highlighted text on her monitor. "Is there an issue?" Vaughn asked mildly. "Mr. Sterling," Elena began, her voice dropping to a low, discreet volume to maintain his privacy. "I see the restriction. It appears your account has been placed under a mandatory administrative freeze. An automated system triggered a federal anti-money laundering protocol." Vaughn sighed softly, the sound barely audible. He had anticipated this complication. The medical disbursement. "Yes," Elena nodded, looking genuinely apologetic. "A wire transfer of $85,000 cleared your account at 0400 hours. The system flagged it because the routing source is highly unusual. It doesn't originate from a standard commercial or civilian government entity. It's categorized in our system under a restricted, non-standard federal origin. A black budget allocation, essentially. Because of the opacity of the source, federal banking laws require the automated system to freeze the asset until we can manually verify it. Because Bode's veterinary bills were being covered by a highly classified fund dedicated to retired Tier-One canine assets, the origin of the money was shielded. To a civilian banking algorithm, a sudden, massive influx of untraceable government cash looked exactly like high-level financial fraud. "I understand the algorithm's reaction, Ms. Rostova," Vaughn said calmly, his tone devoid of any frustration toward her. "It is a classified government medical disbursement. My dog requires a specialized double-joint replacement surgery tomorrow morning, and those funds are required to secure his slot. If you call the federal verification hotline listed on your compliance directory, they will provide a bypass code to authorize the release." Elena looked at him, her eyes darting between his calm face and the red alert flashing on her screen. She was a rule follower by nature, but she appreciated his stoic, reasonable demeanor. "I understand, Mr. Sterling. I truly do. I just need to get the Federal Reserve verification desk on the line. It will just take a quick phone call." "Take your time," Vaughn nodded. But time was a luxury Aspen Ridge did not afford him. The smell of cheap wintergreen mints and leather polish preceded Deputy Trent Lawson. The young officer had crossed the lobby, his predatory instincts triggered by the hushed conversation and his own burning need to interfere. He stepped deliberately into the glass office, invading Vaughn's personal space. He stood far too close, an obvious intimidation tactic, his hand resting casually but purposefully on the bright yellow handle of his taser. "Is there a problem here, Elena?" Trent's voice boomed across the quiet lobby, deliberately loud enough to make nearby customers turn their heads. Trent had his audience. Elena looked up, clearly flustered and annoyed by the intrusion. "No, Deputy Lawson, everything is fine. I am just assisting Mr. Sterling with a routing verification. It's standard protocol." "Standard protocol for what?" Trent demanded, leaning over the desk to look at Elena's screen. He let out a sharp, derisive snort when he saw the flashing red alert. He turned his head slowly, looking Vaughn up and down, his lip curling in disgust. He took in the combat shirt, the canvas parka, the military-style haircut, and the old, injured dog. In his limited worldview, he had already written the narrative. A routing error for 85 grand? Trent mocked, projecting his voice so the entire lobby could hear. "You walk in here looking like you slept in a bus station, tracking snow everywhere, trying to push a massive wire through a frozen account. Deputy, please step back." "I am handling this," Elena said sharply, her professionalism cracking under her frustration with the officer. Trent ignored her entirely. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest beneath his tactical vest. "I know exactly what this is," Trent sneered, pointing a gloved finger at Vaughn's chest. "I've seen a dozen of you stolen valor frauds this year. You buy some tactical gear at an army surplus store, slap a fake red vest on a crippled mutt to get out of the cold, and play the sympathy card hoping the bank will just hand over cash to avoid a scene." Vaughn did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his weight. His ice-blue eyes simply locked onto Trent's flushed face, measuring the vast, empty depth of the young man's arrogance. Down on the marble floor, Bode felt the subtle shift in his handler's muscle tension. The old German shepherd did not bark, but he let out a very low, barely audible rumble from deep within his chest. "You're not a veteran," Trent declared, taking a step closer, completely misreading Vaughn's profound silence as fear. "You're a vagrant playing dress-up, looking for a payout. Hand over that ID right now. We're going to see exactly who you are." Vaughn looked at the young, insecure deputy. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and he knew the storm raging outside was nothing compared to what this officer was about to bring upon himself. Deputy Trent Lawson did not ask for the identification card. Operating on a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and manufactured authority, the young officer closed the distance between them and snatched the heavy laminate directly from Von Sterling's frostbite-scared fingers. The movement was sharp, invasive, and entirely unnecessary, a petty physical escalation designed purely to assert dominance in a room filled with wealthy onlookers. Vaughn did not react to the sudden intrusion. He did not flinch, nor did he attempt to pull his hand back. His heart rate, honed by decades of operating in hostile environments where a single reflexive movement could mean death, remained a steady, rhythmic 55 beats per minute. He simply lowered his empty arm, watching the deputy with the detached, clinical observation of a man evaluating a malfunctioning, highly volatile piece of machinery. Trent stepped back, holding the ID up to the ambient light filtering through the bank's vaulted windows. His lip curled in disdain. It was not a standard-issue common access card that modern military personnel carried. It was an older, heavier credential, bearing a faded, hard-eyed photograph of a younger Vaughn. There was no rank listed beneath the portrait, no shiny holographic overlays, and no expiration date. There was only a Department of Defense seal, a cryptographic barcode, and a dense 16-digit alphanumeric sequence. "What kind of novelty shop garbage is this?" Trent sneered, tapping the edge of the card against his tactical vest. His voice echoed loudly off the mahogany walls. "Deputy Lawson, you are completely out of line." Elena Rostova interjected. She stood up from her ergonomic chair, her polite customer service demeanor fracturing under the weight of the officer's abrasive interference. "Mr. Sterling is a client attempting to resolve a banking matter. I need you to hand him back his property so I can make the federal verification call. I am conducting an investigation into suspected wire fraud, Elena. Step back and let me do my job," Trent snapped, entirely intoxicated by his own perceived power. He unclipped his department-issued smartphone from his belt, opening the local law enforcement database application. "Let's see what the system actually says about our distinguished war hero here." Vaughn closed his ice-blue eyes for a fraction of a second. Here we go, he thought. He knew exactly what the civilian police database would do. Vaughn's operational file was buried beneath Title 50 covert action authorities and layers of top-secret sensitive compartmented information, TS/SCI, clearances. When an unauthorized, unencrypted local terminal queried that specific barcode, the Pentagon's automated defense network initiated a ghost protocol. It was a digital failsafe designed to protect the identities of covert assets. It did not ask for a password, which would only arouse suspicion. Instead, it actively scrubbed the ping, returning a localized dummy error code while simultaneously sending a silent alert to a domestic watch center in Washington. Trent tapped the screen, utilizing the phone's camera to scan the dense barcode. The app buffered. The polished quiet of the Aspen Heritage Bank felt suddenly suffocating. Then, the screen flashed a brilliant, undeniable crimson. No record found. Invalid identification sequence. Trent's face lit up with a vicious, triumphant joy. He shoved the glowing screen inches from Vaughn's face, ensuring the breathless patrons in the lobby could witness his heroism. "No record," Trent hissed, his voice vibrating with adrenaline. "You don't exist in the database. You've never served a day in your life. You're a fake. You're a vagrant playing dress-up, dragging this crippled dog around to squeeze cash out of people." "Deputy Lawson, the routing number is restricted," Elena pleaded, stepping out from behind her desk. "Standard databases will not recognize it. If you just let me call." "Shut up, Elena. He is under arrest." Trent didn't wait for Vaughn to comply. Hungry for the physical dominance he felt he was owed, the deputy lunged forward. He grabbed Vaughn's left wrist, the hand marked by stark, white patches of severe Arctic frostbite. With a brutal, unprovoked jerk, Trent violently twisted the older man's arm behind his back, aiming for a harsh pain-compliance joint lock. A sharp, jagged spike of agony shot through Vaughn's rotator cuff, tearing at old, rigid scar tissue from a catastrophic high-altitude insertion over the Bering Sea decades prior. The pain was blinding, radiating down his spine, but Vaughn's discipline was absolute. He did not grunt, he did not resist. He allowed his arm to be manipulated, perfectly aware that a single defensive strike, which he could execute in 0.3 of a second to shatter Trent's radial nerve, would give the erratic deputy the legal justification to escalate to deadly force. Trent unclipped his steel handcuffs. The metallic ratcheting sound echoed sharply as he clamped the cold metal brutally tight around Vaughn's wrist, deliberately pinching the median nerve. But while Vaughn's restraint was forged in the fires of Black Ops survival, his companion's was not. Down on the marble floor, the dynamics of the room instantly fractured. Bode saw his handler, his alpha, his entire universe being physically assaulted. The 10-year-old German shepherd's protective instincts, honed over years of military service before he transitioned to medical support, violently overrode his conditioning. Despite the severe osteoarthritis degrading his hips, Bode pushed his heavy body up. The rubber soles of his orthopedic boots squeaked against the polished stone as he scrambled to his feet. He positioned his large frame directly between Trent's legs and Vaughn's body. The fur along the dog's spine bristled into a razor-sharp ridge. Bode did not bark. Barking was a waste of breath for an apex predator. Instead, he peeled back his lips, exposing worn but highly lethal canines, and let out a guttural, terrifying snarl that reverberated in the floorboards. Panic, raw and unfiltered, flashed across Trent's face. The sheer size and sudden aggression of the German shepherd shattered the deputy's fragile bravado in an instant. He dropped Vaughn's arm and stumbled backward, slipping slightly on the marble. Operating purely on fear, Trent's hand flew to his duty belt. He bypassed his pepper spray entirely and ripped his bright yellow taser X-26P from its holster. He leveled the weapon directly at Bode's broad chest. The dual laser sights activated, painting 2 bright crimson dots right between the old dog's amber eyes, glowing starkly against his white sugar face. "Call him off!" Trent shrieked, his voice cracking with genuine terror and unchecked aggression. "Call the mutt off right now, or I will drop him." "Deputy, stop! Are you out of your mind?" Elena screamed, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer horror. "He is wearing a red medical harness. He is a registered psychiatric service animal. You are violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is a federal crime to harm him." "He's aggressive. I have the right to defend myself." "Step back," Trent yelled, his finger resting heavily on the trigger, the electrical capacitors inside the weapon whining a high-pitched hum as they armed. Time dilated for Vaughn. The physical pain in his wrenched shoulder vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He looked at the laser dots painting Bode's graying fur. He knew the exact voltage output of that weapon. For a healthy young dog, a 50,000-volt neuromuscular incapacitation was excruciating. For a 10-year-old shepherd with a failing skeletal structure and a weakened heart, it would be an absolute death sentence. The cardiac arrest would be instantaneous and irreversible. Bode would die before he hit the floor. In that microsecond, Vaughn's internal restraints frayed to the breaking point. The urge to break Trent Lawson in half was a tidal wave of violent instinct. But doing so would only lead to a shootout in a crowded bank, and Bode would die in the crossfire. Vaughn swallowed a rage so profound it tasted like copper in the back of his throat. To save his best friend, Vaughn had to betray the dog's deepest instinct to protect him. He had to break the dog's heart. Vaughn looked down at the shepherd who had pulled him out of freezing avalanches and kept his night terrors at bay. "Bode," Vaughn commanded. It was not a shout. It was a low, absolute, and terrifyingly calm vibration that cut through the hysteria in the room like a scalpel. It was the voice of a man who commanded ghosts in the dark, a voice that brokered absolutely no hesitation. Down. Stay. The command hit the German shepherd like a physical blow. Bode's ears twitched. The dog looked at the glowing taser, then up at Vaughn's ice-blue eyes. The conflict within the animal was agonizing to witness. Every muscle in his aging body trembled violently with the desperate biological need to protect his master. A high-pitched, heartbroken whine escaped his throat. But discipline, forged in the fires of war zones and reinforced by a decade of unbreakable bonds, won out. Bode stopped growling. He lowered his heavy head, his ears flattening submissively against his skull. Slowly, painfully, the dog sank back down onto the cold marble floor. He rested his chin on his front paws, his body shivering, though his amber eyes never left Trent. The red lasers continued to dance over his face. He was the picture of perfect, devastating loyalty. Trent let out a shaky, adrenaline-laced breath, keeping the taser trained on the dog while he grabbed Vaughn's free hand, violently snapping the second cuff into place. "Smart move, fake," Trent sneered, recovering his arrogant swagger now that the immediate threat was neutralized. He holstered the taser and grabbed Vaughn, roughly, by the collar of his combat shirt. "Let's go. You're going to a cell, and your fake service dog is going to the pound." "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Lawson," Elena warned, her voice shaking with absolute disgust as she followed them toward the exit. "I am documenting this entire interaction. I am calling the FBI field office, and I am reporting an assault on a disabled client and a service animal." "Tell them to meet me at the station, Elena," Trent replied over his shoulder, entirely dismissive of the threat. He shoved Vaughn toward the heavy glass doors. Vaughn walked in complete silence, his posture impeccably straight, despite his arms being painfully pinned behind his back. "Bode, heel," Vaughn commanded softly. Bode immediately stood up, ignoring the pain in his hips, and followed them. The dog kept a perfect, disciplined heel right beside Vaughn's left knee, even as Trent shoved his handler through the doors. They stepped out of the climate-controlled bank and immediately into the brutal, howling force of the Aspen Ridge blizzard. The temperature had plummeted to -12 degrees. The biting wind slammed into them, driving sharp crystals of ice into their faces. Vaughn shivered, but not from the cold. Trent's patrol vehicle, a heavy, armored Ford Police Interceptor SUV, was parked illegally in the fire lane, its engine idling. Trent opened the rear door of the cab and roughly shoved Vaughn inside onto the hard plastic bench, slamming the door shut. Vaughn adjusted himself, turning his head to look out through the reinforced plexiglass partition. He watched as Trent turned his malicious attention to Bode. The deputy walked around to the rear cargo area of the SUV and popped the heavy trunk lid. Inside was a standard metal K9 transport box, built of heavy-gauge zinc and steel grating. It was designed for holding police dogs, but Trent was not a K9 handler, and the compartment lacked any insulated bedding. "Get in the box, mutt!" Trent barked, pointing into the dark, freezing metal cage. Bode looked at the back window where Vaughn was sitting, then looked at the metal box. He hesitated, the freezing wind whipping his thick, double-layered coat. "Bode, box!" Vaughn commanded loudly through the glass, his heart physically aching at the necessity of the order. Bode obeyed. He hopped clumsily into the back, his arthritic hind legs failing on the first attempt, forcing him to scramble awkwardly and painfully onto the frozen steel floor. Trent laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that was quickly swallowed by the wind. He slammed the heavy metal grate shut, locking the old dog inside. Then, Trent reached into the rear cargo area, found the auxiliary climate control dial for the K9 transport box, and deliberately, vindictively clicked it to the off position. In the sub-zero blizzard, the uninsulated metal box would become a lethal freezer within minutes. Trent slammed the trunk shut, walked to the driver's seat, and climbed into the warm, heated cabin of the SUV. He cranked the front vents to maximum heat, put the vehicle in drive, and peeled out into the slush, the sirens wailing. In the back seat, Von Sterling sat in absolute, terrifying silence. The stinging pain in his shoulder was gone, entirely erased by a chilling, calculating focus. He looked at the back of Trent Lawson's head. The young deputy thought he had just humiliated a worthless vagrant. He had absolutely no idea that by locking that old dog in a freezing cage, he had just awakened a storm far more devastating than the one raging outside the windows. The Aspen Ridge Police Department had been fundamentally dismantled as a municipal entity. In the span of a few violent, highly orchestrated minutes, it was annexed by the federal government, transitioning from a quiet, luxury town precinct into a frontline triage and tactical command center. On the radiant heated concrete of the bullpen, the immediate biological crisis was passing. The federal tactical medic worked with a quiet, intense efficiency, adjusting the flow of the heated intravenous saline entering Boded's front leg. The violent, erratic shivering that had seized the old German shepherd's body was slowly subsiding into a deep, exhausted lethargy. "His core temperature is stabilizing, sir," the medic reported softly, glancing at a specialized veterinary pulse oximeter clipped to Bode's ear. "The thermal miler is trapping the heat. He is out of the red zone. I'm going to keep him on the fluids, but the anchor is holding." Von Sterling exhaled a long, measured breath. He kept his bare, frostbite-scared hand resting against Bode's flank for a moment longer, feeling the steady, reliable rhythm of the dog's lungs. The profound, terrifying vulnerability that had cracked his stoic facade vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He stood up. As his heavy frame straightened, the desperate father disappeared, and the cold, calculating architecture of the Tier-One commander locked firmly back into place. He rolled his injured left shoulder, pushing the dull, grinding ache of the torn rotator cuff into a compartmentalized corner of his mind. He turned his ice-blue eyes towards Special Agent in charge Marcus Hayes. "We are bleeding time, Marcus," Vaughn said, his voice entirely devoid of the tremble it held a minute ago. It was a low, resonant rumble of absolute authority. "Establish the uplink." "Yes, sir," Hayes replied instantly, keying his lapel microphone. "Echo 2, deploy the package." Two federal agents wearing tailored dark suits over Kevlar vests stepped through the shattered electronic front doors. Between them, they carried a massive, matte black Pelican case reinforced with carbon fiber and steel pressure latches. Stenciled in faded white paint across the impact-resistant polymer was a single acronym, MCIF. The agents bypassed the local booking desk entirely and marched straight for the glass-walled office of the Aspen Ridge police chief. "Clear the room," the lead agent ordered, his tone lacking any conversational warmth. The local chief of police, who had been standing paralyzed near his decorative bookshelf, didn't argue. He practically scrambled out into the hallway, his face pale, clutching a half-empty coffee mug as if it were a shield. The agents hauled the heavy 80-pound case onto the chief's polished mahogany desk, carelessly shoving aside framed family photographs, a brass nameplate, and stacks of municipal budget reports. Because the local precinct's civilian Wi-Fi and Ethernet networks were fundamentally compromised and incapable of handling top-secret transmission bandwidths, the federal government had brought its own infrastructure. With mechanical precision, an agent gripped the specialized structural levers on the side of the Pelican case and violently cracked the hermetic seals. Inside was a marvel of cryptographic engineering, a mobile, sensitive, compartmented information facility. It was a self-contained, heavily shielded tactical communications suite designed to establish an impenetrable digital perimeter anywhere on Earth. One agent pulled a thick, braided, fiber-optic cable from the console. Utilizing a handheld, high-intensity glass punch tool, he quickly scored and popped a 3-inch circular hole directly through the precinct's reinforced exterior window. He fed the cable through the freezing gap, connecting it to a deployable microwave satellite dish that another agent was rapidly mounting to the roof of the lead armored SUV outside in the blizzard. Within exactly 3 minutes, they had completely bypassed the town's vulnerable telecommunications grid, establishing a secure, encrypted broadband pipeline directly to the Pentagon. The heavy protective casing inside the Pelican box was stripped away to reveal a folding, dual-screen tactical monitor. The screens flared to life, illuminating the dim office with a stark, bluish glow. Uplink established. Encryption keys locked and verified. The communications agent announced, stepping back from the desk to give Vaughn the floor. Vaughn walked into the office. He didn't sit in the chief's ergonomic leather chair. He leaned forward, planting his knuckles flat on the desk. The primary monitor blinked, displaying the live, secure feed from the White House Situation Room. The man on the screen was Jonathan Croft, the White House Chief of Staff. At 50 years old, Croft usually projected an image of flawless political polish. Today, he looked physically ill. His suit jacket was discarded, his tie was pulled loose, and the harsh fluorescent lighting of the subterranean bunker accentuated the deep, bruised bags under his eyes. Behind him, a flurry of military aides and intelligence analysts moved with chaotic, hushed urgency. "Vaughn," Croft breathed the moment Sterling appeared on the screen, his voice a heavy mixture of profound relief and sharp anxiety. "Thank God they got to you. The blizzard over your sector made this an absolute logistical nightmare." "I am online, Jonathan. Cut the preamble and give me the tactical picture," Vaughn demanded. He did not waste time on pleasantries, nor did he complain about his unlawful arrest. There was only the mission. Croft tapped a command on his end, and the secondary monitor in the Pelican case populated with heavily encrypted, thermal imaging satellite telemetry. It showed a desolate, jagged mountain range completely obscured by heavy weather interference. 4 hours ago, a Joint Special Operations Command Task Force, Devastation Trident, was executing a clandestine extraction of 2 compromised intelligence assets deep in hostile territory. Croft began, his voice tight with the strain of impending failure. They were operating in the Ural Mountains. Vaughn studied the thermal topography. The extraction went sideways. Catastrophically, Croft confirmed, leaning heavily on his conference table in Washington. Enemy mechanized forces intercepted them during the exfiltration window. Simultaneously, a severe localized blizzard moved in, completely grounding our air support and blinding our orbital overwatch. Task Force Trident was forced to retreat underground to survive the elements and protect the assets. Vaughn's ice-blue eyes tracked the red heat signatures swarming the digital map. The geography was immediately, chillingly familiar to him. They sought hard cover in the Zvezda complex, the Soviet-era subterranean bunker. "Exactly," Croft nodded grimly, but the enemy forces didn't lose them. They tracked Trident's thermal signatures to the bunker entrance. The hostiles brought up heavy armor and systematically collapsed the primary reinforced tunnels with artillery fire. Trident is trapped subsurface in the lower levels. They are boxed in. The enemy is currently bringing in heavy thermal drilling equipment to breach the reinforced roof. They are trying to drop thermobaric charges into the ventilation shafts. They are going to burn our men alive. "Why was I not hailed at the onset of the crisis?" Vaughn asked, his voice a flat, emotionless baritone that betrayed none of the tension in the room. Croft dragged a shaking hand down his face. "We did hail you, Vaughn. The Pentagon sent continuous emergency burst transmissions to your encrypted satellite terminal for the last 2 hours. We desperately needed you on the comms. When we lost your transponder signal, the Department of Defense assumed you had been compromised or assassinated by a hostile state actor on U.S. soil. We almost spun up a domestic counterterrorism package." Outside the glass walls of the office, the silence in the bullpen had become absolute and suffocating. The door to the chief's office had been left open. The tactical headsets worn by the Secret Service agents allowed them to hear the comms, but the sheer volume of the Chief of Staff's voice carried clearly across the acoustic panels of the local precinct. Deputy Trent Lawson was still pinned face down on the cold concrete by the federal operator, but his ears were clear. He heard the words White House, Task Force Trident, Ural Mountains, and thermobaric charges. The devastating, catastrophic truth of what he had done slammed into Trent with the physical force of a freight train. The money at the bank hadn't been a scam. The identification card wasn't a fake. And the heavy, black device he had mockingly called a burner phone wasn't used for coordinating street hustles. It was a direct, top-secret lifeline to the United States military. Trent's mind violently short-circuited as he remembered standing at the booking desk, arrogant and bloated with manufactured power. He remembered aggressively ordering Sergeant Higgins to drop that phone into a mylar-lined Faraday evidence bag, a pouch scientifically engineered to block all radio frequencies, cellular signals, and satellite pings. By actively placing that device in a signal-blocking bag to stroke his own fragile ego, Trent Lawson hadn't just broken departmental protocol. He had directly and maliciously severed a top-secret national security communications network. He had blinded the Pentagon during a live hostage crisis. He had single-handedly paralyzed the rescue of elite American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. Trent's stomach violently contracted. He felt hot bile rise in the back of his throat. The sweat pouring down his spine turned freezing cold against his tactical vest. He wasn't just going to be fired. He wasn't just facing a civil rights lawsuit. He had committed an act that bordered on federal sabotage. If those soldiers died in that bunker, the Department of Justice would bury him under a federal penitentiary that didn't have a zip code, and he would deserve every single second of it. His breathing became rapid and shallow, a hyperventilating panic attack seizing his chest as the crushing, unimaginable magnitude of his incompetence slowly suffocated him. Inside the office, Vaughn didn't glance at the terrified deputy on the floor. He didn't care about Trent Lawson's impending destruction. The young man was a localized bureaucratic error that had already been neutralized. Vaughn's entire consciousness was focused entirely on the thermal imagery of the Ural Mountains. The structural blueprints for that specific Ural bunker system were purged from the GRU archives in 1991. Croft continued desperately, the panic bleeding through his professional facade. Satellites cannot penetrate the bedrock. The JSOC team is flying completely blind in the dark. They give Trident less than 15 minutes before the enemy breaches the final blast door. You are the only living intelligence asset who physically mapped those sublevels during Operation Ghost Dance in 1989. We need an alternate egress route, Vaughn, or 20 American operators are going to die in the dark. Vaughn closed his eyes. The ambient noise of the police precinct, the hum of the servers, the wind howling against the cracked glass, the frantic, wheezing breaths of the deputy on the floor faded away entirely. He accessed the deeply compartmentalized, spatial memory of a bunker he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. He remembered the smell of the damp, decaying Soviet concrete. He remembered the agonizing, bone-chilling cold that had scarred his hands. He remembered the exact layout of the ventilation shafts, the load-bearing walls, and the secondary escape hatches that the Soviets had dug and subsequently abandoned. Vaughn opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth. Analytical, calculating, and deadly. "Patch me through to the Trident team commander," Vaughn ordered, leaning closer to the microphone on the mobile SIF. "Tell him to secure his wounded and prep his breaching charges. We are going to dig them out." 19 minutes had elapsed since the encrypted signal punched through the storm. Inside the climate-controlled warmth of the Aspen Ridge Police Department, the atmosphere was steeped in a toxic, manufactured complacency. In the precinct's break room, Deputy Trent Lawson was holding court. He leaned casually against the stainless steel counter, a steaming cup of artisanal espresso in one hand, animating the story of his mourning for 2 wide-eyed probationary officers. He embellished the details of the bank arrest, inflating his own physical dominance over the stolen valor drifter and making crude, dismissive jokes about the shivering dog he had locked in his unheated trunk. His ego was entirely insulated from the reality he had just set into motion. Out at the elevated booking desk, Sergeant Artie Higgins was not laughing. He sat in rigid, uncomfortable silence. He had minimized the computerized intake forms on his monitor, his seasoned, heavy-lidded eyes darting repeatedly toward the digital clock on the wall. and then to the reinforced glass of holding cell 2. Von Sterling stood perfectly still inside the cell, the surplus wool blanket draped over his injured shoulder, projecting an aura of terrifying, absolute patience. Artie could feel the barometric pressure dropping in the room. He was waiting for the storm that the old soldier had promised. It did not begin with the wail of police sirens. It began with a visceral, low-frequency vibration. A deep, guttural rumble shuddered through the radiant-heated concrete floors of the precinct, strong enough to rattle the ceramic coffee mugs in the break room. It sounded like the synchronized, heavy-throttled roar of multiple high-displacement diesel engines being pushed to their mechanical limits. Artie stood up, his hand resting instinctively on his duty belt, though his veteran instincts screamed at him that drawing a weapon right now would be a fatal error. He peered through the frosted front windows. Out in the blinding, swirling whiteout of the blizzard, the headlights of 5 massive, matte black Chevrolet Suburbans materialized like specters. Because the severe weather had grounded all military and federal rotary wing aircraft in the region, the federal government had simply driven a bulldozer through the storm instead. The vehicles were heavily armored. Customized interceptors belonging to the United States Secret Service Counter-Assault Team, CAT, dispatched from the Denver field office under an emergency alpha-level clearance. They did not park politely in the designated visitor spaces. They breached the perimeter, their reinforced tactical brush guards shattering the snowbanks as they aggressively blockaded the precinct's entire front facade. They parked at staggered, tactical angles, completely sealing off all vehicular and pedestrian escape routes. Before the heavy engines even idled down, the doors of all 5 vehicles swung open simultaneously. A dozen federal operators deployed into the blizzard with terrifying synchronized efficiency. Half of them wore heavy, unmarked olive-drab tactical winter gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas, carrying short-barreled automatic carbines held tightly at a disciplined low ready. The other half wore civilian winter coats over tailored dark suits, discreet coiled earpieces stark against their necks. They moved not as a group of individuals, but as a single, devastating, highly lethal organism. The heavy electronic glass doors of the precinct didn't just open. They were violently shoved off their automated tracks by the sheer physical force of the men entering. The sub-zero wind rushed into the lobby, carrying with it a tidal wave of uncompromising federal authority. The local officers in the bullpen froze, their coffee cups pausing halfway to their mouths. A few of the rookies instinctively reached for their holstered sidearms. A fatal miscalculation born of inexperience and panic. Federal authority, hands away from your weapons. Step back from the desks. Do it now. The command cracked through the lobby with the percussive, concussive force of a flashbang. The man who shouted was Special Agent in Charge, Marcus Hayes. He possessed the dense, immovable architecture of a seasoned operator, with a thick, corded neck, closely cropped dark hair, and the sweeping, mathematical gaze of a man accustomed to calculating lethal force. He did not flash a badge or wave a piece of paper. His sheer, predatory presence, combined with the heavily armed tactical operators fanning out to secure the perimeter, was all the identification required. I said, hands off your weapons. Hayes roared again, his voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising register that left absolutely no room for negotiation. Anyone touches a sidearm, they go to the ground. Artie Higgins immediately raised his hands, keeping his palms open and visible. He stepped back from his computer, entirely surrendering the floor. He offered no resistance, his eyes flicking toward the holding cell. Hearing the commotion, Trent Lawson sauntered out of the break room. Blinded by his own ego, he entirely misread the severity of the situation. His arrogant mind simply could not process the visual data that he was no longer the apex predator in the building. "Hey, what the hell is going on out here?" Trent demanded, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his duty weapon as he marched toward the lobby. "You can't just barge into a municipal jurisdiction like this. We have an active booking on a high-level fraud. Agent Hayes's head snapped toward the young deputy. The SAC's eyes narrowed, instantly registering the yellow handle of the taser, the swagger in Trent's walk, and the nameplate on his chest. "Are you Deputy Lawson?" Hayes asked, his voice suddenly dropping to a deadly, chilling whisper. "Yeah, I am." Trent puffed his chest out, trying to project the authority he had wielded so freely at the bank. "And you need to step down and identify yourselves before I." Hayes didn't let him finish the sentence. He didn't even speak. He simply gave a microscopic nod to the operators flanking him. The physical subjugation of Trent Lawson was a masterclass in tactical violence. It took less than 2 seconds. Before the deputy could even unclip his taser or register the threat, 2 federal agents in civilian coats closed the 20-foot distance in a blur. The movement was entirely surgical. One agent seized Trent's right wrist, pivoting sharply to apply a brutal, excruciating pain compliance joint lock that leveraged the deputy's own body weight against him. Trent let out a sharp, breathless yelp as his center of gravity was violently disrupted, forcing him to his knees. Simultaneously, the second agent smoothly stripped Trent's Glock 19 from its holster, removed the taser, and yanked the radio from his belt, tossing the weapons effortlessly across the floor. With a synchronized downward thrust, the agents slammed Trent face first onto the polished concrete floor. A heavy, Kevlar-clad knee immediately dropped onto the center of his spine, pinning him to the ground with the immovable weight of a cinder block. "Hey, get off me!" Trent shrieked, his voice pitching high with genuine panic. His cheek smashed against the freezing concrete. "I'm a police officer. I made the collar. You are a catastrophic liability," Hayes snarled, stepping directly over the thrashing deputy without breaking his stride. "Keep him pinned. If he speaks again, gag him." The local chief of police, a bureaucratic administrator who hadn't drawn his weapon in a decade, finally scrambled out of his corner office. His face was entirely drained of color. "I demand to know by whose authority." Title 18, United States Code. "National Security Directive," Hayes interrupted, completely dismissing the chief's presence. "Your jurisdiction is suspended. Have your men stand down, or they will be federally indicted for obstructing an active tactical operation." Hayes bypassed the trembling chief and marched directly toward the booking desk, stopping in front of Artie Higgins. "Keys," Hayes demanded quietly. Artie didn't hesitate. He unclipped the heavy brass ring from his belt and slid it across the stainless steel counter. Hayes caught the keys and approached holding cell 2. The intimidating, ruthless demeanor of the federal commander evaporated instantly. As he looked through the reinforced glass at the man standing inside, Hayes's posture shifted into one of deep, uncompromising respect. He quickly unlocked the heavy steel deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Mr. Sterling, sir," Hayes said, his tone hushed and deferential. "SAC Hayes, Denver Field Office. I apologize for the delay. The blizzard grounded our air assets, so we had to utilize ground transport." "Are you injured, sir?" Vaughn stepped out of the cell. He did not look triumphant. He looked completely exhausted. The adrenaline of the pain in his shoulder finally beginning to seep into his muscles. He adjusted the wool blanket Artie had given him, exposing the horizontal warning stripes of his combat shirt. The deputy applied an aggressive pain compliance hold over an old rotator cuff tear. "It is an aggravation, Agent Hayes, not a structural failure," Vaughn replied clinically. His ice blue eyes swept the room. "My physical status is irrelevant. Where is my K9 asset?" Before Hayes could answer, a loud metallic crash echoed from the front of the precinct. The shattered electronic doors slid open again. A massive tactical operator jogged into the warm lobby, his heavy winter gear plastered with fresh snow. In his right hand, he carried a large pair of heavy-duty hydraulic bolt cutters, the tool he had just used to violently shear the hinges off the locked zinc transport box in the back of Trent's SUV. In his left arm, cradled tightly against his chest, was Bode. The 10-year-old German Shepherd was in the terrifying advanced stages of severe hypothermia. The violent cold of the uninsulated metal box had mercilessly attacked the senior dog's arthritic joints. His thick, double-layered coat was rimed with frost, and the red medical harness was stiff with ice. His eyes were half closed, his gums pale, and his breathing dangerously shallow and erratic. The operator gently set the massive 80-pound dog down on the radiant heated concrete floor of the bullpen. For the first time since the ordeal began, the impenetrable, stoic facade of Von Sterling cracked. The ice-blue calm in his eyes shattered into raw, unfiltered panic. He ignored the federal agents, ignored the police chief, and ignored the deputy pinned to the floor. Von dropped heavily to his knees on the hard linoleum, completely disregarding the sharp, shooting pain in his left shoulder. "Bode," Von rasped, his voice tightening with a profound, guarded emotion that no human being had heard in years. Von pulled the thick wool blanket from his own shoulders and wrapped it tightly around the shivering animal. He pulled the heavy, graying head onto his lap, pressing his bare, frostbite-scared hands against the dog's chest, desperately trying to transfer his own body heat. Hearing his handler's voice, the old shepherd's amber eyes fluttered open. Despite the agonizing cold locking up his joints, Bode let out a soft, heartbreaking whine. The dog managed to lift his heavy head just a few inches, pressing his freezing, wet nose into the crook of Von's neck, seeking the familiar, grounding comfort of his alpha. "I've got you," Von whispered, his voice trembling as he buried his face in the icy fur of the dog's neck, closing his eyes tightly. "I've got you, buddy. Just hold on." "Medic!" Hayes barked over his shoulder. A federal tactical medic immediately broke formation, sprinting across the lobby with a trauma bag. He dropped beside Von and Bode, instantly ripping open a thermal foil mylar blanket to trap the dog's remaining body heat. He began prepping a heated intravenous saline line to rapidly raise the animal's core temperature, working with the intense focus usually reserved for human casualties. From the floor near the booking desk, Trent Lawson watched the scene unfold with mounting horror. His right cheek was pressed hard against the cold concrete, his arms pinned painfully behind his back. The adrenaline that had fueled his arrogance all morning was gone, replaced by a cold, bottomless abyss of terror. He watched the heavily armed CAT operators securing the exits, their rifles ready. He watched the special agent in charge of the Secret Service addressing the homeless drifter as "Sir." And then he watched the elite federal medic treating the old, crippled dog with the kind of urgent, frantic care usually reserved for a visiting head of state. The devastating reality of his situation crashed down on Trent like a physical weight. The bravado he had worn like armor for his entire adult life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw trembled uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, not from the cold air rushing in through the broken doors, but from sheer, unadulterated fear. He had not arrested a vagrant playing dress-up. He had unlawfully detained, assaulted, and hindered a man whose name moved federal tactical teams through a blizzard, and he had tortured a medical service animal that was apparently under top-tier federal protection. The career he loved was over. His freedom was evaporating before his eyes. He had wanted an audience to watch him be powerful. Now the entire federal government had arrived to watch his absolute destruction. The Aspen Ridge Police Department had been fundamentally dismantled as a municipal entity. In the span of a few violent, highly orchestrated minutes, it was annexed by the federal government, transitioning from a quiet, luxury town precinct into a frontline triage and tactical command center. On the radiant heated concrete of the bullpen, the immediate biological crisis was passing. The federal tactical medic worked with a quiet, intense efficiency, adjusting the flow of the heated intravenous saline entering Bode's front leg. The violent, erratic shivering that had seized the old German shepherd's body was slowly subsiding into a deep, exhausted lethargy. "His core temperature is stabilizing, sir," the medic reported softly, glancing at a specialized veterinary pulse oximeter clipped to Bode's ear. "The thermal mylar is trapping the heat. He is out of the red zone. I'm going to keep him on the fluids, but the anchor is holding." Von Sterling exhaled a long, measured breath. He kept his bare, frostbite-scared hand resting against Bode's flank for a moment longer, feeling the steady, reliable rhythm of the dog's lungs. The profound, terrifying vulnerability that had cracked his stoic facade vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He stood up. As his heavy frame straightened, the desperate father disappeared, and the cold, calculating architecture of the Tier-One commander locked firmly back into place. He rolled his injured left shoulder, pushing the dull, grinding ache of the torn rotator cuff into a compartmentalized corner of his mind. He turned his ice-blue eyes towards Special Agent in charge Marcus Hayes. "We are bleeding time, Marcus," Vaughn said, his voice entirely devoid of the tremble it held a minute ago. It was a low, resonant rumble of absolute authority. "Establish the uplink." "Yes, sir," Hayes replied instantly, keying his lapel microphone. "Echo 2, deploy the package." Two federal agents wearing tailored dark suits over Kevlar vests stepped through the shattered electronic front doors. Between them, they carried a massive, matte black Pelican case reinforced with carbon fiber and steel pressure latches. Stenciled in faded white paint across the impact-resistant polymer was a single acronym, MCIF. The agents bypassed the local booking desk entirely and marched straight for the glass-walled office of the Aspen Ridge police chief. "Clear the room," the lead agent ordered, his tone lacking any conversational warmth. The local chief of police, who had been standing paralyzed near his decorative bookshelf, didn't argue. He practically scrambled out into the hallway, his face pale, clutching a half-empty coffee mug as if it were a shield. The agents hauled the heavy 80-pound case onto the chief's polished mahogany desk, carelessly shoving aside framed family photographs, a brass nameplate, and stacks of municipal budget reports. Because the local precinct's civilian Wi-Fi and Ethernet networks were fundamentally compromised and incapable of handling top-secret transmission bandwidths, the federal government had brought its own infrastructure. With mechanical precision, an agent gripped the specialized structural levers on the side of the Pelican case and violently cracked the hermetic seals. Inside was a marvel of cryptographic engineering, a mobile, sensitive, compartmented information facility. It was a self-contained, heavily shielded tactical communications suite designed to establish an impenetrable digital perimeter anywhere on Earth. One agent pulled a thick, braided, fiber-optic cable from the console. Utilizing a handheld, high-intensity glass punch tool, he quickly scored and popped a 3-inch circular hole directly through the precinct's reinforced exterior window. He fed the cable through the freezing gap, connecting it to a deployable microwave satellite dish that another agent was rapidly mounting to the roof of the lead armored SUV outside in the blizzard. Within exactly 3 minutes, they had completely bypassed the town's vulnerable telecommunications grid, establishing a secure, encrypted broadband pipeline directly to the Pentagon. The heavy protective casing inside the Pelican box was stripped away to reveal a folding, dual-screen tactical monitor. The screens flared to life, illuminating the dim office with a stark, bluish glow. Uplink established. Encryption keys locked and verified. The communications agent announced, stepping back from the desk to give Vaughn the floor. Vaughn walked into the office. He didn't sit in the chief's ergonomic leather chair. He leaned forward, planting his knuckles flat on the desk. The primary monitor blinked, displaying the live, secure feed from the White House Situation Room. The man on the screen was Jonathan Croft, the White House Chief of Staff. At 50 years old, Croft usually projected an image of flawless political polish. Today, he looked physically ill. His suit jacket was discarded, his tie was pulled loose, and the harsh fluorescent lighting of the subterranean bunker accentuated the deep, bruised bags under his eyes. Behind him, a flurry of military aides and intelligence analysts moved with chaotic, hushed urgency. "Vaughn," Croft breathed the moment Sterling appeared on the screen, his voice a heavy mixture of profound relief and sharp anxiety. "Thank God they got to you. The blizzard over your sector made this an absolute logistical nightmare." "I am online, Jonathan. Cut the preamble and give me the tactical picture," Vaughn demanded. He did not waste time on pleasantries, nor did he complain about his unlawful arrest. There was only the mission. Croft tapped a command on his end, and the secondary monitor in the Pelican case populated with heavily encrypted thermal imaging satellite telemetry. It showed a desolate, jagged mountain range completely obscured by heavy weather interference. 4 hours ago, a Joint Special Operations Command Task Force, Devastation Trident, was executing a clandestine extraction of 2 compromised intelligence assets deep in hostile territory. Croft began, his voice tight with the strain of impending failure. They were operating in the Ural Mountains. Vaughn studied the thermal topography. The extraction went sideways. Catastrophically, Croft confirmed, leaning heavily on his conference table in Washington. Enemy mechanized forces intercepted them during the exfiltration window. Simultaneously, a severe localized blizzard moved in, completely grounding our air support and blinding our orbital overwatch. Task Force Trident was forced to retreat underground to survive the elements and protect the assets. Vaughn's ice-blue eyes tracked the red heat signatures swarming the digital map. The geography was immediately, chillingly familiar to him. They sought hard cover in the Zvezda complex, the Soviet-era subterranean bunker. Exactly, Croft nodded grimly, but the enemy forces didn't lose them. They tracked Trident's thermal signatures to the bunker entrance. The hostiles brought up heavy armor and systematically collapsed the primary reinforced tunnels with artillery fire. Trident is trapped subsurface in the lower levels. They are boxed in. The enemy is currently bringing in heavy thermal drilling equipment to breach the reinforced roof. They are trying to drop thermobaric charges into the ventilation shafts. They are going to burn our men alive. Why was I not hailed at the onset of the crisis? Vaughn asked, his voice a flat, emotionless baritone that betrayed none of the tension in the room. Croft dragged a shaking hand down his face. We did hail you, Vaughn. The Pentagon sent continuous emergency burst transmissions to your encrypted satellite terminal for the last 2 hours. We desperately needed you on the comms. When we lost your transponder signal, the Department of Defense assumed you had been compromised or assassinated by a hostile state actor on U.S. soil. We almost spun up a domestic counterterrorism package. Outside the glass walls of the office, the silence in the bullpen had become absolute and suffocating. The door to the chief's office had been left open. The tactical headsets worn by the Secret Service agents allowed them to hear the comms, but the sheer volume of the Chief of Staff's voice carried clearly across the acoustic panels of the local precinct. Deputy Trent Lawson was still pinned face down on the cold concrete by the federal operator, but his ears were clear. He heard the words White House, Task Force Trident, Ural Mountains, and thermobaric charges. The devastating, catastrophic truth of what he had done slammed into Trent with the physical force of a freight train. The money at the bank hadn't been a scam, the identification card wasn't a fake, and the heavy, black device he had mockingly called a burner phone wasn't used for coordinating street hustles. It was a direct, top-secret lifeline to the United States military. Trent's mind violently short-circuited as he remembered standing at the booking desk, arrogant and bloated with manufactured power. He remembered aggressively ordering Sergeant Higgins to drop that phone into a mylar-lined Faraday evidence bag, a pouch scientifically engineered to block all radio frequencies, cellular signals, and satellite pings. By actively placing that device in a signal-blocking bag to stroke his own fragile ego, Trent Lawson hadn't just broken departmental protocol. He had directly and maliciously severed a top-secret national security communications network. He had blinded the Pentagon during a live hostage crisis. He had single-handedly paralyzed the rescue of elite American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. Trent's stomach violently contracted. He felt hot bile rise in the back of his throat. The sweat pouring down his spine turned freezing cold against his tactical vest. He wasn't just going to be fired. He wasn't just facing a civil rights lawsuit. He had committed an act that bordered on federal sabotage. If those soldiers died in that bunker, The Department of Justice would bury him under a federal penitentiary that didn't have a zip code, and he would deserve every single second of it. His breathing became rapid and shallow, a hyperventilating panic attack seizing his chest as the crushing, unimaginable magnitude of his incompetence slowly suffocated him. Inside the office, Vaughn didn't glance at the terrified deputy on the floor. He didn't care about Trent Lawson's impending destruction. The young man was a localized bureaucratic error that had already been neutralized. Vaughn's entire consciousness was focused entirely on the thermal imagery of the Ural Mountains. The structural blueprints for that specific Ural bunker system were purged from the GRU archives in 1991. Croft continued desperately, the panic bleeding through his professional facade. Satellites cannot penetrate the bedrock. The JSOC team is flying completely blind in the dark. They give Trident less than 15 minutes before the enemy breaches the final blast door. You are the only living intelligence asset who physically mapped those sublevels during Operation Ghost Dance in 1989. We need an alternate egress route, Vaughn, or 20 American operators are going to die in the dark. Vaughn closed his eyes. The ambient noise of the police precinct, the hum of the servers, the wind howling against the cracked glass, the frantic, wheezing breaths of the deputy on the floor faded away entirely. He accessed the deeply compartmentalized, spatial memory of a bunker he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. He remembered the smell of the damp, decaying Soviet concrete. He remembered the agonizing, bone-chilling cold that had scarred his hands. He remembered the exact layout of the ventilation shafts, the load-bearing walls, and the secondary escape hatches that the Soviets had dug and subsequently abandoned. Vaughn opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth, analytical, calculating, and deadly. "Patch me through to the Trident team commander," Vaughn ordered, leaning closer to the microphone on the mobile SIF. "Tell him to secure his wounded and prep his breaching charges. We are going to dig them out." The transition of the Aspen Ridge police chief's glass-walled office into a live, top-tier forward operating base was absolute. The mobile SIF's dual monitors cast a harsh, austere blue light over Vaughn Sterling's face, illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw and the deep, tired lines around his ice-blue eyes. The ambient noise of the civilian precinct, the humming of the HVAC system, the muted whispers of the local cops in the bullpen, the howling of the blizzard against the shattered front doors, faded into insignificance. They were replaced by the raw, terrifying acoustics of a subterranean siege playing out thousands of miles away, bleeding through the encrypted speakers. It was a chaotic, high-fidelity symphony of compressed violence. The staccato crack-crack-crack of hostile Kalashnikov fire echoed sharply against Soviet-era concrete, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic, bone-rattling thudding of industrial thermal drills, attempting to bore through the bunker's reinforced ceiling. Every few seconds, the deep, concussive boom of an impact grenade shook the microphone on the JSOC operator's end, reducing the audio to a violent, ear-splitting blast of static. "Trident Actual, this is Sentinel," Vaughn said, leaning closer to the tabletop microphone. His voice was a low, steady anchor cast into a sea of absolute chaos. "Report your immediate status." A heavy burst of static broke the feed, followed by the breathless, adrenaline-laced voice of the JSOC team commander. "Sentinel, this is Trident Actual. We are pinned in Sublevel 4, Sector Bravo. We have our 2 high-value assets secure, but we are combat ineffective. We have 3 wounded, 1 critical with arterial bleeding. Hostiles are massing on the primary blast doors. Thermal drills are 20 meters above us and dropping fast. They are preparing to drop thermobaric incendiary charges through the boreholes. We are completely out of room, sir." Vaughn stared at the thermal topography on the secondary monitor. His eyes scanned the red, blooming clusters of enemy forces rapidly closing in on the trapped Americans. The visual telemetry was abstract, a cold digital representation of the battlefield, but the audio, the frantic shouting, the deafening gunfire, the desperate hollow echoes of men fighting in a concrete tomb was intimately, devastatingly real. And then a profound, catastrophic physiological shift occurred within Von Sterling. The human brain, regardless of decades of elite, Tier-One psychological conditioning, maintains a primal, indelible archive of trauma. For Von, the sounds echoing from the speakers were not merely incoming tactical data points. They were violent, unrestrained ghosts. The unique acoustics of the bunker triggered a sudden neurological flashback to a highly classified, disastrous extraction he had commanded during Operation Ghost Dance in 1989. It was the exact same hollow concrete echo, the same desperate radio calls from dying men, the same metallic scent of blood, pulverized rebar, and burning cordite that had haunted his darkest nightmares for 25 years. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not care that he was currently sitting in a safe, climate-controlled police precinct in Colorado. It bypassed his frontal lobe and attacked his central nervous system with absolute, unforgiving ruthlessness. Von's heart rate spiked violently, leaping from a resting, controlled 55 to over 140 beats per minute in a matter of seconds. His breath hitched in his throat, turning shallow, ragged, and entirely insufficient. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead. His frostbite-scared hands, which had remained perfectly still while Trent Lawson had wrenched his shoulder in cuffs, now rested on the mahogany desk and began to exhibit a fine, uncontrollable kinetic tremor. The edges of his vision darkened, tunneling inward as the paralyzing grip of a severe dissociative panic attack took hold. He was rapidly losing his cognitive grip on the present moment, slipping backward into the dark, frozen hell of his past, entirely paralyzed by the neurochemical storm. "Sentinel?" Trident. Actual's voice crackled desperately over the speaker, the panic of a doomed man bleeding through his training. "Sentinel, we need an egress route now. The blast door hinges are buckling under the heat. Give us a vector." Vaughn opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the tactical command that would save their lives, but his throat seized completely. He couldn't form the words. The tactical genius that the White House Chief of Staff was desperately relying on was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own unhealed trauma. Outside the glass office, the federal tactical medic had just finished checking the heated IV fluid bag attached to Bode. The old German shepherd was lying on the radiant heated concrete floor of the bullpen, wrapped tightly in the thermal foil mylar blanket. His core temperature was finally stabilizing, but he was profoundly exhausted, his arthritic joints undoubtedly screaming from the brutal exposure in the unheated police transport box. Yet, despite his immense physical weakness, Bode's amber eyes remained locked on the glass office. A service dog trained in advanced psychiatric support does not rely on visual or auditory cues alone. They are biologically attuned to the microscopic, chemical shifts in their handler's physiology. Bode smelled the sudden, sharp spike in cortisol and adrenaline radiating from Vaughn. He heard the subtle, frantic alteration in his handler's breathing pattern, recognizing the biological distress signal immediately. Bode didn't wait for a command. He didn't look at the medic for permission. With a monumental, agonizing effort, the 10-year-old shepherd pushed his heavy body off the floor. His hind legs, clad in the black orthopedic boots, trembled violently under his own weight, but he absolutely refused to collapse. The thermal blanket slid off his back as he limped slowly, painfully, toward the glass-walled office. The Secret Service agent standing guard in the bullpen, highly trained in threat assessment and behavioral analysis, recognized instantly that the dog was not acting aggressively. They parted silently, allowing the crippled, fiercely loyal animal to pass. Bode pushed his nose through the open doorway of the office. He didn't whine, bark, or seek affectionate attention. He moved with a singular, clinical purpose. He stepped up beside Vaughn's chair, turned his large body, and deliberately leaned his entire 80-pound weight against Vaughn's left leg. Then, Bode pushed his heavy, graying head firmly beneath Vaughn's trembling hand, resting his chin heavily and solidly on the older man's thigh, effectively pinning Vaughn to the chair. It was a textbook. Flawless application of deep pressure therapy, DPT, The firm physical weight and the steady rhythmic warmth of the dog's breathing sent a massive, grounding tactile signal directly to Vaughn's parasympathetic nervous system, actively disrupting the brain's fight-or-flight loop. Vaughn gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, as if breaking the surface of deep water after nearly drowning. His trembling fingers instinctively curled into the thick, coarse fur on the back of Bode's neck. "I am here," the heavy, unyielding pressure of the dog's weight communicated silently. "We are not in the dark, we are here." Vaughn closed his eyes tightly. He forced his mind to focus entirely on the physical sensation of the dog. He matched his breathing to the slow, steady rise and fall of Bode's ribcage. The grounding technique acted as a neurological circuit breaker. The paralyzing grip of the flashback shattered. The phantom smell of burning cordite evaporated, replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of wet fur and winter snow. The ghosts retreated, banished by the warm, undeniable reality of the dog pressing against his leg. When Vaughn opened his eyes just 3 seconds later, the panic was completely gone. The ice-blue clarity of the sentinel had returned to his eyes, sharper, colder, and more lethal than before. He keyed the microphone, his voice a low, rumbling anchor of absolute certainty that cut through the chaos on the radio. "Treat actual. This is Sentinel. Listen carefully. You are not going to hold that blast door. You are going to abandon it." "Copy, Sentinel," the team commander replied, the sheer relief in his voice palpable at the return of his commander's voice. "Where do we go?" "The primary tunnels are collapsed, and the ground-penetrating radar shows solid rock in all directions. The Soviets didn't trust their own engineering, and they didn't document their failures," Vaughn explained rapidly, his eyes mapping the blank, dark spaces on the thermal monitor purely from memory. "In 1989, I mapped a secondary, unlisted ventilation shaft designed to siphon toxic gases from the lower armory. It runs parallel to your current position in the south ventilation axis. It bypasses the primary choke points entirely and breaches the surface 300 meters east of the main entrance. We have no schematics for a secondary shaft, Sentinel. We are looking at a solid, reinforced, load-bearing wall. It is a false wall, Trident," Vaughn stated with absolute conviction. "Stand facing the primary blast door. Turn exactly 90 degrees to your right. Walk 12 paces south. You will see a rusted, decommissioned electrical junction box mounted on the concrete." There was a tense silence over the radio, broken only by the sound of heavy boots moving quickly over debris. "I am at the junction box," Trident Actual confirmed. "The concrete directly behind that box is not reinforced with rebar. It is a hollow masonry patch concealing the ventilation access," Vaughn instructed. "Take your C4 plastic explosives. Do not shape a breaching charge. Mold the C4 completely flat against the junction box to create a broad, concussive push, not a focused, shattering explosion. You have 60 seconds before those thermobaric charges drop from the roof. Blow the wall, secure your wounded, and move into the shaft. Do you copy?" "Copy that, Sentinel. Prepping the charge. Stand by." The audio feed went dead silent. The tension inside the mobile SIF was agonizing, a physical weight pressing down on the room. Jonathan Croft leaned so close to his monitor in the White House that his forehead nearly touched the screen. The Secret Service agents in the Aspen Ridge bullpen stood frozen like statues, their hands hovering over their weapons, listening to the silence. Even Trent Lawson, still pinned to the floor by the federal operator, stopped trembling. His breath caught in his throat as he realized he was listening to the live execution of a desperate, subterranean rescue mission that his own arrogance had almost completely sabotaged. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Then 20. A sudden, sharp burst of static erupted from the speakers, followed instantly by a dull, concussive thump that vibrated heavily through the audio feed. Then, nothing but the hiss of dead air. Vaughn didn't move. He kept his hand firmly buried in Bode's fur. He knew the mathematics and the physics of the blast. If his memory of the structural integrity was wrong, if the Soviets had retrofitted that wall with rebar after he had surveyed it, the concussive force of the C4 would bounce backward, killing the American operators instantly in the confined space. 30 agonizing seconds passed. "Sentinel, this is Trident Actual." The voice was breathless, coughing heavily through thick concrete dust, but it was miraculously, undeniably alive. "Jackpot. I say again, jackpot. We have breached the false wall. We are inside the secondary shaft. It is clear. The hostiles just breached the primary blast door behind us, but they are firing into an empty room. We are moving subsurface to the extraction point now. You just pulled us out of the grave, Sentinel." A collective, massive exhale swept through the entire precinct. In the White House Situation Room, Jonathan Croft slumped back into his chair, wiping a heavy sheen of cold sweat from his face as cheers erupted behind him. The Secret Service agents in the bullpen allowed themselves a rare, tight smile of profound professional satisfaction. Von Sterling finally released his grip on the microphone. He leaned back in the chief's ergonomic chair, the adrenaline rapidly draining from his body, leaving a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. He looked down at Bode. The old German shepherd, having completed his mission and stabilized his handler, slowly lowered his heavy head onto Von's combat boot, closing his amber eyes and letting out a long, contented sigh. "Good boy," Von whispered, his voice incredibly soft, filled with an emotion he rarely showed the world. "Good boy, Bode." The adrenaline that had electrified the Aspen Ridge Police Department for the past hour slowly metabolized, leaving behind the heavy, hollow quiet that always follows a survived crisis. Inside the glass-walled office, the secondary monitor of the mobile SIF blinked, shifting from the thermal telemetry of the Ural Mountains to a secure, green confirmation screen. 20 American operators were moving safely toward their extraction zone. On the primary monitor, White House Chief of Staff Jonathan Croft adjusted his collar, looking as though he had aged a decade in the span of an hour. The camera angle widened slightly, revealing the man seated behind the resolute desk. The President of the United States looked weary, yet the immense palpable relief on his face softened the deep lines around his eyes. "Mr. Sterling," the President began, his voice transmitting with crystal clarity into the makeshift command center. "There are 20 American families who will not receive a folded flag this week solely because of your actions today. The nation owes you a debt it can never adequately repay. I have already instructed the Department of Defense to begin the expedited paperwork. I intend to present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We can arrange a private, classified ceremony in the Oval Office at your earliest convenience." Von leaned forward, his weight supported by the edge of the mahogany desk. He kept his uninjured right hand resting gently on the thick, graying fur at the scruff of Bode's neck. The 10-year-old German shepherd was breathing steadily, now the thermal mylar blanket reflecting the ambient light of the screens. Von did not smile at the offer. His posture did not straighten with pride, and his ice-blue eyes did not widen at the prospect of the highest civilian honor in the country. He looked at the screen with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who had long ago stopped needing validation from the world. "With all due respect, Mr. President," Von replied, his deep baritone perfectly level, entirely devoid of ego, "I must decline the medal. I left that life behind a long time ago. I stepped back into it today for exactly 20 minutes, and that was 19 minutes too long. The men in the dark did the dying, sir. They did the surviving. I just remembered a blueprint." Jonathan Croft frowned slightly, though his eyes held deep understanding. "Von, if you won't accept the commendation, what can this administration do for you? Name it." "Anything." Von's gaze shifted briefly through the shattered glass of the office toward the bullpen. Sitting nervously on a metal folding chair near the booking desk, flanked by 2 Secret Service agents who had escorted her from the bank for debriefing, was Elena Rostova. The bank manager looked terrified, clutching a disposable coffee cup, entirely out of her depth in a room filled with heavily armed federal operators. "There is a civilian bank manager sitting in the lobby," Von said, looking back at the monitors. "Her name is Elena Rostova. She is a consummate professional who was merely trying to follow federal compliance laws before she was violently interrupted." I want absolute assurance from the Treasury Department that her career will not suffer any bureaucratic blowback from this incident. Furthermore, I need the Federal Reserve to immediately unfreeze the medical disbursements in my account. My dog's joint replacement surgery is scheduled for 0800 hours tomorrow in Denver. That is the only action I require." The president smiled faintly, a look of profound, genuine respect crossing his features. "Consider it done, Mr. Sterling. The restriction will be lifted before you walk out of that building. The blizzard has grounded our helicopters, but my detail will provide armored ground transport for you and your K9 directly to the Veterinary Surgical Center." "Thank you, Vaughn, for everything." The feed cut out. The blue light of the monitors faded to black. The federal agents in the room immediately began the rapid, mechanical process of dismantling the mobile SIF, returning the precinct to its civilian reality. Vaughn stood up. Using his right hand, he carefully unclipped the heavy, crimson medical harness that had frozen solid in the transport box, handing the icy fabric to the federal medic so Baudet wouldn't have to carry the unnecessary weight. Vaughn pushed himself upright, his left shoulder screaming in dull, agonizing protest from the pain compliance hold applied hours ago. He ignored it, compartmentalizing the pain with practiced ease. He walked out of the office and into the bullpen. Bode limped faithfully by his side, his black orthopedic boots squeaking softly against the polished concrete. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted as Vaughn approached. The local cops stood silently, their eyes cast downward. The bullpen was no longer a tactical staging ground, it was an active federal crime scene. Special agent in charge, Marcus Hayes, stood near the center of the room. On a plastic chair directly in front of him sat Deputy Trent Lawson. The swagger, the arrogance, and the desperate need to perform for an audience had been completely and violently stripped away from the 28-year-old officer. Trent's uniform was wrinkled, stained with the dirty slush from his polished boots. His wrists were secured tightly behind his back in heavy-duty federal zip ties. He was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed and frantically darting around the room, desperately searching for a sympathetic face. He found none. Two agents from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, wearing distinct navy blue windbreakers, had arrived during the tactical blackout. They were currently standing over Trent holding a digital tablet. "Deputy Trenton Lawson," the senior FBI agent began, his voice carrying the cold, mechanical efficiency of the federal justice system. "You are being remanded into federal custody. The charges against you include, but are not limited to, deprivation of rights under color of law, violating Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. Furthermore, you are facing multiple felony counts under the Americans with Disabilities Act for the willful endangerment, unlawful detainment, and attempted aggravated assault of a registered psychiatric service animal." Trent's breath hitched into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. The crushing weight of the charges was astronomical, but the agent wasn't finished. Finally, the agent continued, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "You are being federally indicted for active interference with a classified national security operation resulting from your malicious handling of a top-secret communication device." I didn't know," Trent stammered, tears of sheer terror and self-pity spilling over his eyelashes, his voice cracking into a whine. "I was just enforcing the banks. The ID bounced back. I thought he was a fake. I didn't know." "Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Lawson," Sack Hayes interrupted, stepping closer and effortlessly ripping the silver deputy's badge off Trent's chest. The sound of tearing fabric echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Especially not for the people hired to enforce it. You used a badge to bully an older man and torture a crippled dog to stroke your own pathetic ego. You are looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary." As the FBI agents moved to haul Trent to his feet, Von Sterling stepped directly into their path. The federal agents stopped immediately, granting the former Tier-One operator total deference. Trent flinched, instinctively cowering away. He braced himself, fully expecting the older man to strike him, to scream in his face, or to unleash an explosive barrage of verbal humiliation that he, in Vaughn's position, would have absolutely delivered. But the explosion never came. Vaughn Sterling did not shout, he did not flex his muscles, and he did not raise a hand. The absolute, terrifying stillness in his posture was infinitely heavier than any physical violence could ever be. Vaughn looked down at the broken, hyperventilating man on the chair. His ice-blue eyes were not filled with rage, vengeance, or vindictive triumph. They were filled with something far more devastating to a narcissist, absolute, uncompromising pity. "You wear that uniform because you are fundamentally terrified of being small," Vaughn said. His voice was so quiet, so perfectly calm, that Trent had to strain to hear it over the howling wind outside the shattered doors. Trent slowly raised his eyes, unable to break contact with the icy gaze holding him in place. "You saw a man with a limp and an injured dog, and you saw an opportunity to feel big," Vaughn continued, the gravel in his voice carrying the immense, crushing weight of his lived experience. "You didn't care about the law. You didn't care about the truth. You just wanted an audience to watch you be strong." Vaughn leaned in a fraction of an inch, his presence utterly eclipsing the young man. "I have spent my life alongside the most dangerous, capable men on this planet," Vaughn whispered, his words acting like a scalpel, dissecting the absolute core of Trent's fragile ego. "They never shouted. They never bullied the weak to prove they were strong. True strength is quiet, Lawson. It does not need an audience. It absolutely never needs to humiliate another human being to prove it exists. You are going to have a very long time in a very small cell to think about the kind of man you want to be. I suggest you use it to find some quiet." Vaughn straightened up, breaking eye contact. He turned his back on Trent Lawson forever, dismissing him entirely from his reality. He walked toward Elena Rostova. The bank manager stood up quickly, wiping a tear of relief from her own eye. "Mrs. Rostova," Vaughn said politely, offering a small, reassuring nod. "I apologize for the severe disruption to your morning." "No, Mr. Sterling, please," Elena stammered, holding up her phone. "The Treasury hotline just called me directly. The restriction on your account has been completely lifted. The funds for Boded's surgery have cleared the surgical center. I am so deeply sorry for what happened to you both today. You acted with integrity." "Thank you," Vaughn replied smoothly. Finally, Vaughn turned to the elevated booking desk. Sergeant Artie Higgins was standing there, his hands resting on his duty belt, the faded Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm. The older cop didn't say a word, but the profound respect in his heavy-lidded eyes spoke volumes. He had risked his pension to pass that phone through the cell bars, guided by a silent brotherhood that transcended municipal laws. Vaughn reached out and picked up his heavy canvas parka from the counter. He slipped his good arm in first, carefully maneuvering the heavy fabric over his injured left shoulder, zipping it up to conceal the tactical combat shirt and the white frostbite scars on his hands. Vaughn looked at Artie. He didn't offer a dramatic salute or a lengthy speech. He simply gave the desk sergeant a slow, silent nod of absolute, unbreakable respect. Artie nodded back, a slight, knowing smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Safe travels, Sentinel." "Keep your head down, Sergeant," Vaughn replied. He looked down at the floor. "Bode, heel." The old German shepherd immediately fell into step beside Vaughn's left leg. They walked out of the climate-controlled precinct, stepping past the heavily armed federal operators and the idling, armored SUVs. They stepped back into the brutal, howling vortex of the Aspen Ridge blizzard. The wind whipped against Vaughn's face, but he didn't shiver. He walked with his disciplined, rhythmic cadence, leaning slightly into his limp, while Bode's orthopedic boots crunched softly against the freshly fallen snow. They didn't look back at the flashing lights, the federal agents, or the ruined life of the arrogant deputy. They simply disappeared into the thick, white curtain of the storm, returning to the quiet, peaceful obscurity where true strength always resides. True strength is rarely the loudest voice in the room. As Vaughn's journey reminds us, real power does not require an audience, and it never relies on diminishing others to prove its worth. In our daily lives, We are often pressured by a culture that equates loudness with authority and reaction with courage. Yet, the most profound victories are entirely silent. They are found in our restraint when provoked, in the unseen sacrifices we make for those who depend on us, and in the quiet dignity of knowing our true value before God. When you face the freezing blizzards of someone else's arrogance or unfair judgment, remember that you do not have to raise your voice to weather the storm. Your unwavering peace is your greatest armor. I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. How do you hold on to your quiet center when the circumstances around you become overwhelmingly loud? If this message brought you value today, please consider subscribing to the channel for more meaningful stories. May God grant you the wisdom to silence the noise of pride, the grace to protect the vulnerable, and the quiet strength to stand firm in what truly matters.